Hello friends, and welcome back to Moonlight Science, where we drift through the mysteries of our planet under the calm glow of curiosity. Tonight, I invite you to exhale the day, settle into stillness, and let your mind wander with me. Back to a time when a single mountain almost silenced humanity itself. Picture a volcano so vast that when it exhaled, the sky darkened across the entire world. Crops failed, rivers froze, sunlight fell pale and thin through an ashen veil. This was not myth or warning. It was history. Tonight, we explore how one eruption nearly erased humankind. Yet, somehow, we endured. Beneath the thick green veils of Sumatra, where mist drifts lazily through valleys and cicadas sing over the shimmer of hot springs, a giant slept. The people of the future would call it Mount Toba, though in this deep Pleistocene past there were no names, only a restless mountain breathing quietly through its pores. For hundreds of thousands of years it had been part of the landscape's rhythm, building, collapsing, rebuilding again in a cycle both patient and merciless. Its slopes were draped in rainforests, vibrant with life. Giant trees tangled in vines, hornbills flashing through the canopy, and rivers glinting like threads of light between ferns. To any creature wandering those slopes, nothing seemed dangerous. The steam that rose from cracks in the earth smelled faintly of minerals and heat, a reminder that life's foundation rested on fire. Deep below that tranquil skin, the real drama unfolded in silence. The mantle, Earth's slow, molten heart, moved like thick honey, pushing upward, feeding pockets of magma trapped beneath the crust. Each pulse forced the chamber beneath Toba to swell slightly, filling with liquid rock laden with gas and pressure. Imagine a heartbeat that takes millennia between thumps, each one stronger than the last. The mountain's flanks flexed, invisible to the creatures living above it. Yet the tension was building toward a moment that would defy imagination. Within that vast subterranean reservoir, molten stone churned and seethed at more than 1,000 degrees, crushed under the planet's weight. Bubbles of gas gathered like restless spirits searching for release. Chemically, physically, it was a system straining against its own limits. And there are limits, even for mountains. When pressure surpasses the strength of rock, nature chooses the only outlet it knows: eruption. Above this hidden furnace, the world appeared stable. The island of Sumatra lay snug within the equatorial belt, drenched in warmth and monsoon rains. Forests crawled across its ridges, elephants' ancient cousins grazed among palm meadows, tigers stalked quietly in the undergrowth. In the seas beyond, coral reefs glowed beneath sunlight, and fish darted between their shadows. Yet every stone, every leaf, every lungful of air shared space with a force that was quietly preparing to remake the entire planet. Far away, across continents and oceans, another story played out. In Eastern Africa, small bands of Homo sapiens, our ancestors, roamed dry grasslands under a sky heavy with stars. They hunted antelope with stone-tipped spears, gathered roots and berries, and told the first whispered stories around fires. Their world was already edged by cold. Ice had begun its slow march from the poles, locking water away in glaciers. But to these early humans, the climate still allowed survival. Rivers flowed, herds moved, and the rhythm of seasons guided their lives. They had no way to know that their fate would soon hinge not on the stars they watched, but on a volcano whose name they would never know. Inside Toba's buried cauldron, gases continued to accumulate. Pressure climbed like breath held too long. Magma rose through fissures, dissolving more volatile compounds, adding to the unbearable tension. Scientists today compare the volume of this chamber to entire mountain ranges. Thousands of cubic kilometers of molten rock waiting behind a lid that was beginning to crack. In geological time, moments of catastrophe move slowly at first, then with terrifying acceleration. A subtle earthquake here, a new vent opening there. The forest creatures would have felt small tremors beneath their paws, seen strange clouds of steam drift against an otherwise tranquil sky. Life went on, unaware that these were the first murmurs of an awakening giant. It is in this uneasy stillness that the story begins. A paradise poised on the edge of obliteration. For every bird call echoing through the canopy, there was a vibration in the crust below, answering it in secret. The mountain did not roar yet. It only breathed, and the world continued its quiet routine. But every drop of magma, each shifting crystal inside that pressure-mad chamber, added another heartbeat to the countdown. Somewhere under the lush valleys and calm lakes, the planet's greatest bomb ticked. Humanity's ancestors, half a world away, sharpened their tools, sang their small songs, and gazed at horizons they hoped to cross. They could not know that a single pulse of Earth itself would soon cast a shadow over their entire future. The giant slept for now, but its dreams were full of fire. The world 74,000 years ago was already shivering. Ice spread down from the high latitudes in pale tongues, gnawing at once fertile valleys as the planet edged deeper into a long glacial breath. Winters stretched, summers weakened, and the line between desert and grassland kept creeping north and south like slow-moving tides. From orbit, if anyone had been watching, the Earth would have looked patchy and uncertain. Gleaming white caps smudged with gray dust, continents bruised by drought, and oceans reflecting a colder, paler sun. The planet was not yet locked in full ice age, but the balance tilting toward it was fragile, a glass ready to spill with a single tremor. Across Africa, the savannas that had once been green carpets of grass were fading to tawny brown. Herds of antelope, zebra, and elephant wandered great distances in search of shrinking watering holes. Rivers thinned into winding threads, their beds cracking in the heat of dry winds that blew from the north each season with less mercy. Early humans followed the herds, thin shadows moving with the rhythm of survival, their skin dusted with the same ochre earth they walked upon. The nights came colder now. Campfires hissed and guttered under new winds that whipped down from the highlands. Even the stars seemed sharper, as if the cooling air made the heavens themselves more brittle. In the forests of Europe and Asia, mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses stirred among pines laden with frost. Saber-toothed cats crouched low along riverbanks where ice clung to the reeds. Each creature, each blade of grass, was tuned to a narrow comfort, just enough warmth, just enough rain, just enough light. Small changes could unmake entire balances. The Earth's great climate engines, its ocean currents and jet streams, were tightening their knots. Few could sense it then, but the planet was holding its breath. And under the volcano in Sumatra, that breath was about to be stolen. The atmosphere of the Pleistocene was a mirror of subtle forces. Carbon dioxide hovered at low levels. Tiny oscillations in Earth's orbit guided temperatures with patient precision. When trade winds shifted just a little, rain belts moved hundreds of miles, turning lush forests into scrub or dry plains into lakes almost overnight. Life had adapted to these rhythms, but only to gentle swings, the sort that gave time for generations to adjust. What was coming would be no gentle swing, but a shove so violent that every pattern of life would scramble to survive it. The animal kingdom already bore signs of strain. In lake beds, sediments recorded years when algae bloomed wildly, then vanished altogether. Pollen counts from cores taken today reveal grasses giving way to drought-tolerant shrubs, then flickering back again in confused succession. Nature was trying to find a new footing, testing possibilities as the climate leaned colder. Humans, thinly scattered across Africa, the Middle East, and southern Asia, were part of that experiment, whether they knew it or not. Their populations were small, tens of thousands at most, and their survival depended on knowing the land intimately. When fruit ripened, where rivers turned safe to cross, where to find caves that blocked cutting wind, their entire world depended on subtle predictability. Under ordinary circumstances, the slow cooling might have continued for centuries before ice reclaimed more of the globe. There would have been hardship, yes, but not extinction. Then Toba began to move. Each tiny tremor deep beneath its flanks sent faint ripples outward, vibrations that barely whispered through rock but altered the fates of everything breathing under the open sky. When the pressure beneath Sumatra reached its breaking point, it would not simply vent a mountain's fury, it would alter the planet's chemistry and plunge an already delicate world into sudden darkness. Looking back, it's easy to see the foreshadowing written everywhere. The climate poised on a knife's edge, ecosystems gasping for equilibrium. Humans learning to make fire just as the heavens prepared to take the sun away. The earth was ready for a spark. Toba, the sleeping giant, was almost ready to deliver it. All it would take was one fracture, one release, and the gentle slide toward cold would become a headlong dive. The world thought it knew winter. It was about to learn what true darkness felt like. It began with a groan so deep the forests could feel it. The soil trembled under the roots of trees, and birds lifted from the canopy in a rolling wave of panic. At first it was only sound, a low, thunderous moan echoing through the valleys. Then seconds later, the world itself lurched. Cracks split across Toba's slopes, entire hillsides heaved as if the island were breathing its last. For a single, breathless instant, there was silence. The air hung still, every animal frozen in dread anticipation. Then the mountain tore itself apart. The ground erupted with a roar that dwarfed every storm the world had ever known. Stone and fire burst from the heart of Toba, hurling the summit into the sky. A column of molten rock, ash, and lightning surged upward faster than sound, piercing the clouds, blasting through the upper layers of the atmosphere until it reached the stratosphere 40 kilometers above. The sound wave raced across oceans, shaking mountain ranges thousands of miles away. In that first minute, more energy was released than all the nuclear weapons humanity would one day invent combined. To the creatures within 100 kilometers, death came faster than thought. Pyroclastic flows, searing avalanches of gas and pulverized rock rushed outward at hundreds of kilometers per hour, glowing rivers of destruction that hugged the ground and consumed everything in their path. Forests vaporized. The air itself ignited. Rivers flashed into steam, their beds boiling in seconds. Any life caught in the open was erased. Bodies turned to shadows, burned into stone before they had time to fall. Even the seas near Sumatra writhed with waves of scalding debris, rolling outward as tsunamis smashed distant shores. Above this apocalypse, the sky swirled in color and flame. The eruption column rose like a second mountain, its sides lit by perpetual lightning as particles collided violently inside it. Ash darkened the sun to a sullen orange disk, then to nothing at all. Noon collapsed into midnight. The entire region fell under a falling rain of pumice and glass, each grain carrying the heat of the mountain's fury. The smell of sulfur and burned stone filled the air, stinging any living throat that tried to breathe. Animals fled blindly, their tracks filling behind them with gray powder. Days blurred within hours. As the eruption continued, its fury did not ebb but deepen. The magma chamber beneath the volcano was vast, so vast that the collapse of its roof took days to complete. Each cave-in forced more gas and lava into the atmosphere, magnifying the storm overhead. Great arcs of lightning reached kilometers long, striking from the rising cloud into the earth below. The noise was continuous, an unending howl of pressure and thunder that could be felt in the bones more than heard. At its height, the eruption was a planet-sized wound. Rivers of lava hundreds of meters thick spread across the island, turning entire valleys into molten lakes. Ash mixed with rain to form slurries that buried whole landscapes. Even the ocean offshore turned a dull gray, coated in floating pumice that spread like a continent of stone upon the waves. Nights were lit by crimson reflections bouncing off the vast mirror of particles in the sky. To any observer far away, the horizon would have glowed for weeks. When at last the immediate violence faded, the mountain was gone. In its place remained a crater 100 kilometers wide, its rim jagged and steaming like the edge of a torn planet. The noise ebbed to a deep hiss, the breath of earth exhaling after unspeakable strain. Yet the devastation had only begun. The ash that now drifted in thick veils above the world would settle slowly, blocking the sunlight, twisting weather into chaos. What started as an island's destruction would soon envelop the globe. But in that first day, the day the mountain burst, Earth itself had seemed to scream. And for the first time in millions of years, life trembled not at predators or hunger, but at the fury of the ground beneath its feet. The hours after Toba's eruption were shrouded in unending twilight. The sky, once bright with blue and cloud, now seethed as a cauldron of roiling ash that turned daylight into a dim, flickering dusk. From that sky, fire began to fall. Tiny shards of volcanic glass, sharp enough to slice the flesh of leaves, drifted downward like snow forged in a furnace. Each flake glowed faintly, carried by winds that screamed through the forests and over boiling lakes. The rain that followed hissed against the ground. It was not water. It was acid born of sulfur and ash, burning through bark, leaf, and skin alike. The forests that had thrived for ages around Toba ignited like paper lanterns in a gale. Trees, coated in hot dust, burst into flame when struck by debris still burning from their fall through the dark column above. Lightning leapt continuously from the churning plume to the ground, turning the horizon into a web of electric veins. Every flash revealed scenes of unraveling life. Elephants crushed beneath collapsing trees, rivers overflowing with gray foam, the sky itself glowing in waves of copper and red. The taste of metal hung everywhere, and the air was thick enough to chew. Lakes frothed into furious boil. Fish rose lifeless to the surface, their scales hairline cracked by sudden heat. Steam billowed across the valleys, mingling with the choking ash instead of offering relief. Rivers turned from clear currents to brimming torrents of mud the color of blood. Stones clattered within them, rolled along by currents pulsing with ash and melted rock. Where those rivers met the sea, the fresh and salt water mixed into heavy sludge that drifted for miles, smothering corals and choking currents. The living ocean near Sumatra suffocated silently under its own blanket of dust. The rain continued for days. With every drop, the earth lost more of its green. Leaves curled inward as if in terror before disintegrating under acidic onslaught. Animal carcasses sank into the mud, buried instantly by the relentless fallout that grew deeper each hour. Surfaces once solid, paths, nests, dens, became shapeless dunes of ash that hissed as they settled. Even the sound of the world changed. Birds once deafening in their calls were silent. The hiss of rain and the soft crackle of far-off fires became the planet's only voice. Temperature plummeted with each layer of soot crowding the sun. But near the volcano, heat still radiated fiercely from the new magma fields. In one world, the ground froze. In another, it burned. Within a few days, nothing recognizable remained across hundreds of kilometers. The island was blanketed in a sterile gray wasteland, where trees stood as ghostly silhouettes of charcoal. Rivers ran thick and sluggish under the weight of ash. Entire ecosystems collapsed in an instant, the delicate mesh of predator and prey, flower and pollinator, all severed. The animals that somehow survived the first hours, those hiding in burrows or distant caves, emerged into a world they no longer understood. Their eyes were reddened by dust, their lungs filled with toxic air, their instincts useless amid a landscape erased of scent and sound. Far offshore, sailors, or what passed for them in that ancient time, would have seen the horizon darken unnaturally. Ash settled upon distant islands in a suffocating carpet, blurring day and night. Even rainwater gathered in crevices turned poisonous, etching patterns into stone and dissolving what it touched. As winds carried the plume westward, the first hints of its greater reach began. A dark smear across the Indian Ocean, carried higher and wider until it began to veil the entire equatorial belt. The local night of fire would soon become a global dusk. At ground zero, though, the work of destruction concluded almost in silence. The fires starved themselves without oxygen, replaced by the ghostly hiss of falling ash. The air cooled, though it was still heavy, smelling of sulfur and wet stone. Above the vast collapsed caldera, the volcano exhaled one last plume, thin, pale, weary, as if the earth itself sighed after an act too immense for memory. In those smoldering valleys, the first raindrops of the cooling storms began to patter. They gathered in pits and hollows, forming acid pools that reflected nothing. Where life had sung in light and color, now only gray remained, the palette of a planet marking the beginning of its darkest chapter. High above the ruins of Sumatra, the ash column rose in a spiral that defied imagination. It spread outward with the grace of a storm too large for comprehension, its summit flattening as winds caught it and dragged it east and west, turning what had been a single plume into a shroud. The particles it carried, microscopic shards of glass, droplets of acid, crystals of sulfur, floated higher than any bird could climb. Driven by stratospheric winds, they began their slow, encircling journey around the globe. The earth had inhaled Toba's breath, and now it exhaled shadows. Sunlight no longer touched the ground as it once did. The scattering of light by sulfate aerosols dimmed the skies to a lusterless gray. Even where the sun broke through, its warmth was filtered and thin, the rays fractured into faint, eerie glows like light through smoked glass. Days that should have been bright were now sallow and cold. The line between morning and evening blurred. The rhythm of day confused even the most ancient instincts. Far from the volcano's heart, in Asia and Africa, life looked upward at a sky that refused to explain itself. The world had turned strange. In Africa's high plains, the dawn arrived clothed in copper. The horizon bled with color, red so deep they looked bruised, violet halos framing a dim sun hovering behind the dust. For a few hours the light shimmered, as though the atmosphere itself were burning. But as the day progressed, the glow dulled to brown, then gray, leaving fields cold beneath their own twilight. Animals paused mid-stride, uncertain if the world had reached evening again. Insects hid, mistaking the gloom for night. The air smelled faintly metallic, a hint of sulfur wafting across continents carried by winds that had traveled from the heart of destruction. Within weeks, temperatures began to slide. Earth's surface cooled sharply as sunlight bounced off the newly formed haze. Oceans lost their gentle evaporation. Clouds drifted sluggishly, and rain became sparse, often falling as sleet even in places where frost had never before bitten. Crops that had grown on fertile plains wilted, unable to find warmth. Grasslands turned brittle. Herds roamed bewildered, following ancient migration paths that no longer led to food. Predators starved after them, and the songs of birds that once filled tropical mornings vanished, replaced by the crackle of dry seed pods splitting open in cold wind. Over the coasts of India, sunsets glowed with impossible beauty. Bands of crimson and tangerine stretching across the horizon, so brilliant that early evening looked aflame. Yet these fiery skies were only the side effects of suffering above. The suspended ash reflected colors at the edges of sunlight while blocking its heart. To human eyes, the heavens looked like a warning written in gold and blood. To the rest of life, they meant confusion. Darkness came too soon. Seasons lost their meaning. Nights reached deeper cold. In Asia's river valleys, frost crept along reeds that had never known ice. In just a few months, the planet's thermostat had plunged several degrees, more than enough to tip ecosystems into panic. Lakes near the equator cooled to temperatures that stunned fish into stillness. The wind carried fine black dust that settled on leaves like an infection, coating everything in grit. When rain did fall, it was darker than before, the soot bleeding into streams until they ran the color of slate. Even far from Toba, the air trembled faintly with the memory of what had happened. On the steppe where mammoths trudged and on the plains where humans hunted, the light took on a strange amber hue that made shadows seem fuller than reality. The sun was there, and yet it wasn't. Veiled behind a permanent curtain, it rose and set, but never fully returned. Plants that depended on long hours of brightness faltered, and the animals that fed on them weakened. Hunger became the planet's new language, spoken fluently from pole to equator. By the time the gases and particles had wrapped the globe entirely, Earth had entered into a dusk that would last for years. Every sunrise was a half-promise, never fulfilled. It was as if the sun itself were retreating, afraid to illuminate what the mountain had done. And though no human alive then could have grasped the scale of it, they knew one simple truth in their bones: that the sky had changed, and with it, the rules of the world. The cold crept in quietly at first, slipping over the land like an unseen tide. Within a year of Toba's eruption, the fine veil of ash circling the globe had thickened into an armor of shadow. The sun could no longer pierce it with the warmth life depended upon. Even in regions that had never known frost, mornings came shrouded in mist that glittered faintly with ice crystals. Lakes that once steamed with heat now mirrored a pale, sunless sky. The world's breath slowed, as if the planet itself were trying to conserve energy for a winter that refused to end. Temperatures fell by several degrees everywhere, a change so abrupt that entire ecosystems stumbled. In the tropics, trees that had never shed their leaves began to wither. Their roots, denied sunlight, failed to draw enough energy to sustain them. Across the great grasslands of Africa, the green faded to brown, then to bone-gray stalks that crumbled under wind. The vast herds that had once darkened the horizon, wildebeest, antelope, and buffalo, wandered endlessly in search of even a hint of fresh growth. They followed their memories, not realizing that the cycle of renewal had broken. Without plants, the web of life unraveled strand by strand. Grazers starved first, their bodies falling where they stood, bones soon dusted with frost instead of ash. Predators followed, their empty stomachs turning them desperate, then weak. The air, once alive with the cries of birds, turned eerily still. The insects that should have cleaned the remains froze in their burrows. Even scavengers found nothing left to devour. In the silence that spread across continents, the world felt deserted, a theater emptied of actors, yet still echoing with the chorus of what had been. For humankind, scattered across this darkened planet, hardship became the measure of existence. Hunter-gatherer bands that had once moved with the confidence of rhythm found the old patterns meaningless. Rivers ran sluggish and cold, fish vanished, and the small fruits they gathered froze on their stems. Every hunt took longer, every reward was smaller. They learned to boil roots to draw out meager nutrition, to eat bark when nothing else remained. Fire became precious, the single difference between life and stillness. But even flame seemed weaker under the dense sky, its warmth fading quickly into the unfeeling air. The chill deepened each moon. Snow-dusted mountains that had never worn white, while glaciers surged outward, claiming valleys inch by inch. Ocean currents slowed, and storms changed their paths, drawing rain away from lands that needed it most. Famine rippled outward like waves in a dying sea. Children were born only to die within weeks. Elders faded quietly, their stories dissolving with their breath. In some places, humanity collapsed entirely, leaving behind mere traces. A few stone tools buried in the dust. A single footprint where a riverbank had frozen mid-flow. Hunger changed people as profoundly as the cold did. Tribes fragmented or gathered tighter in the hope that together warmth might last longer. Cooperation and conflict became twin instincts, each carrying a different promise of survival. Those who learned to share, to follow the distant coasts where fish clung to life, endured. Those trapped inland disappeared into myth, echoes carried forward in the genome rather than in memory. Animals, too, adapted where adaptation was possible. Some migrated toward volcanic vents, where the soil still baked warm enough to support shrubs and moss. Others hibernated in lengths unknown before, sleeping through the eternal gray in burrows lined with ash. Yet most simply vanished, undone by the arithmetic of scarcity. The earth was pruning itself, closing chapters in a story too overgrown to continue unchanged. Years blurred into decades of dim light and sharpened survival. Snow fell where once monsoons had danced. The silence of extinction spread like a blanket over continents. When warmth finally returned, when the ash began to drift back to the earth and the sun's rays strengthened, the survivors would inherit a planet transformed. But they did not know that yet. They only knew the sound of the wind over dead plains, the hollow rumble of their stomachs, and the unending wait for morning that never grew bright. It was a winter without mercy, and the world would never quite forget it. Ichor of their fires, the last stars remaining on earth. Farther inland, others took refuge in the mouths of caves, where heat still pulsed from deep within the ground. In Ethiopia's rift valleys and on the Indian subcontinent, volcanic fissures that had once seemed perilous now offered warmth. Steam rose from cracks in stone, and the air tasted metallic and strange. But it was life. Mothers wrapped infants in animal furs, softened by smoke. The days passed in silence, except for the hiss of rainfall beyond the cave entrances, rain that carried the sting of acid, but now, at least, did not freeze. Above them, the landscape was unfamiliar. Forests reduced to skeletal wood, riverbeds carved into gray labyrinths. The people who remained seldom wandered far. They had learned that the world beyond the next ridge might already be dead. Archaeologists reading the story in bone and soil would one day call this period a bottleneck. Genetic evidence traced in the strands of modern DNA suggests humanity shrank to perhaps only a few thousand breeding individuals. A single village worth of souls scattered across continents. Every person alive today descends from that impossible fragility. From men and women who endured hunger so sharp it blurred the edges of vision. From children who watched the elders disappear one by one but kept tending the fire anyway. They did not know they were the last hope of their line. They only knew that stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant the silence of ash. The world around them bore little sound but the crackle of ice. Winds moved dust across valleys where animals had once thundered. Occasionally, a herd of gaunt survivors, ancient antelopes, thin felines, passed through and vanished, leaving barely a mark. People gathered the bones they found, cracking them open to drink the marrow, and from their stone tools grew subtle changes. Blades sharpened finer, scrapers carved with more care. Necessity was becoming intellect. Survival was teaching innovation quietly, without ceremony, in the shadows of catastrophe. Time stretched thin. Generations lived and died beneath this muted sky, breathing air that still stung faintly of sulfur. The stars, when visible through breaks in the haze, became myths of light, reminders that brightness still existed somewhere far above the clouds. Language deepened, story became comfort. Around clustered fires, they spoke of the time before cold, of rivers that had sung and trees that had carried fruit sweet as promise. Memory grew sacred, binding the living to what had been lost. In that way, humanity's true endurance began, not through strength of body, but through the stubbornness of remembrance. When the skies finally began their slow brightening, when the first real dawn in decades crept pale over the horizon, those hidden survivors emerged thinner, quieter, but unbroken. Their footprints led from the coastlines and caves, small signs pressed into new, tender soil. The world they stepped into was changed beyond recognition, yet its air carried a faint warmth again, enough to stir hope. In their eyes flickered the reflection of the fires they had kept burning through the long dark. And in that faint gleam lay the entire future of humankind, a future reborn from the edge of extinction. Hidden within every human cell lies a record older than language, a story written not on paper or stone, but in the spiraling code of life itself. It hums quietly inside us, a memory of survival etched into the chemistry of our being. When scientists first began unlocking that code, tracing the patterns of mitochondrial DNA, passed down like a secret from mother to child, they discovered something chilling and magnificent. The strands converged not into countless origins scattered across the world, but into a narrow braid, a single thread stretching back to the same small pool of ancestors. The genetic whispers told a truth more haunting than any myth. Humanity had nearly been erased. In the aftermath of Toba's eruption, as volcanic winter tightened its gray grip, our species dwindled to a fraction of its former number. Modern geneticists can see the fingerprints of that collapse even now. Across continents, across every line that separates one culture from another. The sequences echo the same constriction. Evidence that tens of millennia ago, there were so few of us left that the diversity of all humankind could have fit inside a single valley. Every mutation, every small irregularity in our genes mirrors the moment the world tried to fold our lineage closed. Yet somehow, That bottleneck became a funnel from which the future poured. The mitochondrial study of Eve, a maternal ancestor shared by all living humans, is not meant to name a single woman, but a lineage that survived when all sister branches fell. Her descendants, stretched across coasts and caves, carried with them the tenacity of those hidden enclaves that endured the volcanic night. The genes of people living now, from the Arctic's frozen lands to the equatorial forests, still bear identical sequences in delicate sections of their DNA, like recurring verses in an ancient lullaby. They whisper of resilience born from scarcity. We are all, in a genetic sense, rediscovering that same handful of souls who faced starvation, thunder, and endless darkness and refused to vanish. The bottleneck that Toba carved into our past reshaped every chapter that followed. Low numbers forged closeness, inbreeding at first, but later cooperation, as survival demanded it. Smaller gene pools meant fewer immune defenses, fewer inherited tools to fight disease, forcing adaptation not through abundance, but through ingenuity. The result was a species wired for empathy, communication, and invention, not advantages of strength, but of cohesion. Where other creatures evolved tougher hides or sharper teeth, we learned to share warmth, to divide food, to dream together beneath skies still smeared with ash. Even now, our physiology bears traces of that era's trials. The genes involved in stress response, metabolism, and skin pigmentation show signs of intense natural selection, sculpted by famine and cold. The long winter honed us into survivors crafted for endurance. The paradox is astonishing. The same event that nearly destroyed us also shaped the unity of the species we became. Our shared ancestry means that no matter how varied our appearances or languages, we are family many times over, bound by DNA that narrowed through fire. The entire human story, every migration, every invention, every song sung around later campfires, unfolded from those few who pulled themselves through catastrophe. When researchers compare mitochondrial sequences across billions of humans today, they find only faint ripples of divergence, as though the genetic sea had once been pressed tight between stone cliffs before flowing outward again. That moment of compression became the hinge of our existence. If history were a single breath, Toba was the exhale that nearly ended it, followed by a slow, trembling inhale that filled the lungs once more. Inside each of us, the echo remains. It is the quiet proof that our ancestors stood beneath a sky without sun, that they saw their world frozen and burning at once, and endured. Our blood carries the map of their resilience. Every heartbeat keeps their defiance alive. We are not merely descendants of survivors. We are the continuation of their vow that life, once kindled, would not be extinguished by ash or ice. The volcano wrote its warning in stone, but we carry its answer in flesh. A species reduced to a whisper, yet still determined to sing. Across Southeast Asia, the earth lay smothered beneath a frost of ash. What had once been a quilt of emerald jungle and glittering river systems now stretched gray and lifeless to the horizon. Trunks of ancient trees jutted at odd angles from the slag-like ground, blackened stumps marking the ghosts of entire forests. In places, the blanket of volcanic debris reached 5 meters deep, concealing everything: the bones of animals, the seeds of plants, even whole valleys swallowed as if history itself had been erased. When the wind stirred, the ash lifted in pale clouds, reshaping the terrain like dunes on a dead planet. The land breathed dust instead of air. In the days immediately after the eruption, fire had been everywhere. Now, the fires had burned themselves out, leaving only a landscape of char and silence. The surviving mountain slopes steamed from residual heat, venting plumes that carried the stench of sulfur across the islands. Lakes formed in the hollows of cooling lava, their surfaces coated with an iridescent sheen that mirrored no color found in nature. The water was too hot, too toxic, its depth simmering with chemicals drawn from Earth's belly. Birds that tried to drink along the edges perished where they stood. The wind blew light flakes of ash into their feathers until they looked like stone statues and vanished beneath the settling dust. Where Borneo's lowland jungles had once roared with the chatter of monkeys and the buzz of insects, there was nothing but thin mist hanging over fields of gray. The soil beneath the ash was locked away from sunlight and oxygen. Roots decayed into tangled fossils within weeks. Rivers that had once run clear now rolled thick as wet cement, dragging pumice downstream until estuaries became clogged and lifeless. Even the ocean floor transformed. Coral reefs near Sumatra were buried beneath layers of soot, their brilliant structures suffocated by sediment that turned the sea into a lightless canyon. In a few decades, those reefs would harden into rock, erasing traces of the vibrant ecosystems that had glowed beneath tropical currents. The sky above remained a dull iron hue for years. Heat from the sun was scattered by airborne aerosols before it could reach the surface, leaving temperatures too cold to coax new growth. Seeds that had survived underground waited in vain for warmth to wake them. Occasionally, tiny green shoots dared to break through the gray crust, only to wither before reaching a handspan of height. Life had been forced into stasis, paused between destruction and renewal. Only time, patience, and the slow wash of rain would eventually wear down that sterile barrier to free the nutrients trapped below. Until then, the forests held their breath. Far to the west, on the fringes of India, the signs of change arrived as dust on the wind. The air carried the scent of sulfur even across oceans. Hunters stepping over once familiar grasslands found prints of animals gone missing, streams that had dried, horizons thick with haze. Herds migrated in erratic directions, confused by the shifting climate. Birds flying south for seasonal warmth found only colder air waiting. For early humans scattered along coasts and inland plains, the difference between life and death often balanced on how quickly they read the planet's new rhythm. They did not know its cause, only that the world's heart seemed to be beating slower. In Indonesia, where the mountain once stood, rain eventually began the work of healing. Each storm stripped away a thin layer of ash, carving valleys and gullies through the wasteland. Minerals dissolved into rivulets, flowing toward the sea like veins of hope. Over centuries, these rivers would create new soil fertile beyond measure. But for now, they only whispered faintly beneath the cold drizzle. The silence stretching above them was cosmic, the hush of creation beginning again after undoing itself. Life's return was slow, cautious. Moss crept in first, clinging to stones like green fog. Ferns followed, their fronds unfurling through the dim light as if reaching for courage. Beneath them, the first insects reappeared, thin and pale, feeding on decay. And somewhere, perhaps along the few surviving coastlines, small bands of humans looked toward the east where the sky still faintly glowed from the distant caldera. They would have seen no fire now, only the outline of the clouds still drifting from a mountain that had become a crater. To them, it might have appeared as if the sun itself had fallen there, and the earth was still mourning. Weeks after the eruption, a faint haze began to appear over the eastern horizon of Africa. At first, it seemed like any other season. Dust storms had long been familiar companions of the wind. But this haze was heavier, stranger, scented faintly of brimstone. The sky turned the color of pewter even at midday, the sun a dull disk that could be stared at without pain. Ash had traveled thousands of kilometers on the breath of the stratosphere, falling softly over a continent that had yet to understand it was being swept into the same catastrophe. Each grain that drifted down onto the savannas of humanity's cradle carried the mark of a mountain that had torn itself apart an ocean away. The bright yellows and greens of grasslands dulled to ghostly gray. When rain finally came, it fell thick, mixing with the airborne ash to create a slurry that coated everything. The plains turned to slick plains of mud, every footprint instantly swallowed. The puddles that formed glistened with strange metallic films, tasting of acid on the tongue. Herds hesitated to drink, their reflections distorted by the sheen. When the clouds parted, no cleansing clarity returned. The haze only gloated, glowing copper at the edges as the sun fought to break through. The mountains of Ethiopia, once vibrant with plant life, began to lose their shimmer. Particles settled on every leaf, dimming the light that nourished them. As sunlight weakened, so did photosynthesis. Grass failed first, then shrubs, until whole slopes stood barren. Monsoon winds faltered, their cycles broken by the cooling of the seas. The rain that had shaped life across this land for millennia came late and thin. Rivers shrank, retreating into narrow bends of cracked clay. Lakes that had been mirrors to the sky became shallow, shrinking patches of brine bordered by salt-encrusted earth. Fish populations collapsed. Flamingos and wading birds vanished in search of water that still breathed. For the people who called this land home, survival turned into an act of constant motion. They followed the remaining game from one drying waterhole to the next, walking through fields still smeared with the gray fingerprints of the mountain's ash. The sun, their oldest companion, lost its warmth. Days were shorter, nights colder. Fires smoked instead of blazing, smothered by damp air and the fine dust that settled even in caves. Skin cracked in the dry wind, eyes burned from particles floating unseen. Yet humanity persisted, leaner and more cunning than before, learning to read the faint language of survival written in the silence of the changed world. The drought spread outward like a tightening knot. Vegetation that had served as shelter began to die, forcing hunters into open terrain where every movement was an act of exposure. Spears grew lighter, the chase grew longer. People turned more often toward the coasts, following gulls and the scent of tide. Here, at least, the ocean still offered traces of life, though even its surface reflected the dimness of the sky. The salt air burned nostrils already irritated by ash, and the fish caught in nets were small, pale, their scales dulled. Still, they were food, and life clung to them like a secret whispered between waves. The Great Lakes, Victoria, Tanganyika, Malawi, each suffered their own ordeal. Raised dust from the dried plains blew into their basins, turning the waters cloudy and thick. Evaporation slowed as the air cooled, but the balance still shifted into scarcity. Shores receded, revealing beds cracked by sun and wind. Animal bones dotted the margins where hippos once wallowed. The entire ecosystem leaned perilously toward collapse, balanced on the thread of what little light still pierced the haze. And yet, amid this desolation, small acts of endurance glittered. Families shared warmth in huddled shelters, using woven grass mats coated in ash that repelled the rain. They crafted tools from scavenged bone and learned new paths among the dim hills, guided not by landmarks, but by memory. Some carried embers in hollowed horns as they traveled, preserving flame from one shelter to the next. Those glowing coals became as sacred as life itself, the flickering heartbeat of a species determined not to fade. When eventually the gray rain slowed and the clouds thinned, The land below wore scars of both drought and flood. Parched valleys beside mud flats, bleaching carcasses beside trickles of new streams. Africa, humanity's first home, had endured the test. Out of the ash-streaked soil, the next generation of survivors would rise, a people shaped by storms they never saw, by a far-off volcano that had turned their cradle of life into a proving ground for resilience. Along the coasts where land met the restless sea, small groups of humans found a refuge that the mountains could not bury and the drought could not devour. While the plains behind them withered and the forests fell silent, the ocean continued its endless rhythm, untroubled by the ash that dimmed the skies above it. Each wave that rolled across the rocks carried a whisper of possibility. Even under the pall of volcanic winter, the tides obeyed no command but the moon's. They rose and fell with calm defiance, creating a pattern the survivors could trust when the rest of the world had forgotten its own. Here, at the fragile edge between water and earth, humanity became a species of ingenuity. Families built shelters from driftwood bleached by the ashen light, half buried against the wind. Fires, dampened by the salt air, smoked more than they flared. Yet their glow served as promise against the long nights. When the tides ebbed, they revealed feasts hidden in plain sight. Shellfish clinging to rock, stranded fish flopping in tidal pools, strands of seaweed glistening like dark ribbons waiting to be gathered. The people learned the rhythm quickly. What to take, what to leave, and when to move before the tide reclaimed what it had lent. The sea did not give generously, but it gave enough. These survivors learned to trap fish by building fences of stone and weaving barriers from reeds that directed the currents into natural pockets. As the waters retreated, they collected their catch by hand, swift and grateful. Seaweed became both food and fiber. Dried, it served as fuel and as lining for shelters against the cold winds that still carried a trace of sulfur from the far-off catastrophe. Children played among the tide pools, learning to spot the flicker of movement beneath the surface, turning survival into familiarity. The ocean had become their teacher, its constancy a reminder that cycles still existed when seasons elsewhere had been lost. When the air grew colder and the frost crept even into coastal valleys, these sea-bound bands wrapped themselves in fur and kelp woven together. They gathered seabird eggs from cliffs, moved along beaches in small migrations that followed the patterns of the waves, and stored fish by burying them beneath the cool sand. Where the land offered death, the shore offered a tenuous thread of life. The tides never failed them, and with each generation, knowledge deepened. A map written not on hides or bone, but in memory. Where the safest coves lay, which shellfish were sweetest, when storm currents warned of danger before skies darkened. To live by the sea meant learning patience in the face of eternity. The people watched gray horizons where the sun rose as a dim ember, finding comfort in its persistence even when warmth barely reached their skin. They spoke of the water as though it were a spirit that neither betrayed nor spared them, but existed beyond all sorrow. Every time a new child was born, the elders would dip their hands into the surf and sprinkle salt water over the infant's brow, a covenant between their fragile blood and the everlasting waves. They did not know that their choices, humble between stones and foam, would anchor the very survival of their species. The inland tribes were fading, the highland families vanishing one by one. But along the coasts, the sea people endured. Thousands of years later, archaeologists would unearth their story in fragments. Beads made from shells polished by human fingers, tools shaped from bone and coral, hearths nested in the remains of caves that once opened onto ancient beaches. These relics speak not just of survival, but of adaptation written in the language of tide and salt. The sea people had become masters of balance, not conquerors, but caretakers of their narrow world. While the storm of Toba's fury reshaped continents and silenced jungles, a few hundred humans standing knee-deep in cold surf kept the spark of mankind alive. The ocean, vast and unbroken, became their cradle, and when the darkness finally began to lift centuries later, it would be from these damp and wind-battered shores that humanity would rise once more. In the age when the sky forgot how to clear, warmth became the most precious element in the world. The people who survived along coasts and valleys lived beneath a dome of soot and cold that no memory could recall as different. They were born into grayness and raised under skies that only hinted at light. The sun was spoken of like a spirit gone into hiding, something that had once loved the earth but no longer trusted it. Days bled into nights with little distinction, save for the modest circles of glow from campfires that burned against the chill. Those flames became the only proof that brightness still existed. Around these fires, humanity grew inward, reshaping not only its habits, but its very mind. The flame's crackle was comfort, its breath a lullaby against the endless wind. Children learned to guard it as carefully as life itself, feeding it with whatever driftwood or bone could be found. When the fire flickered low, panic rippled through camps like shared instinct. The elders spoke softly then, coaxing courage with the same rhythm they used to coax sparks from stones. Fire was no longer merely a tool. It became guardian, teacher, and God. Each new generation inherited fear that had no name, only shape. The heavy clouds overhead, the sudden quakes that sometimes rattled the ground, and the strange sounds of distant thunder that never brought real rain. The people, trying to give reason to chaos, began to weave meaning out of their suffering. They imagined that the volcano, the one that had cloaked the world in smoke, was a sleeping creature whose anger still smoldered. Some said the ash that fell upon their ancestors had been the creature's breath, a warning from below. Others believed the sky itself was grieving, weeping gray tears for a world that had disappointed it. Myths grew not from fancy, but from longing, for order in a world that no longer offered it. The stories, passed from parent to child, took shape around the fires as medicine against despair. They told of a time before the darkness, when forests whispered in green tongues and rivers laughed as they ran. The elders repeated that those days would come again if the people were patient and kind, if they cared for one another and tended fire with devotion. Each tale was a fragment of hope, disguised as memory. In those narratives, humanity found something new, a world of imagination that could outlast hunger or fear. To tell a story was to light another kind of flame, one that burned within the chest. Language itself deepened in that gloom. Words evolved for shades of gray, for the quiet between waves, for these different ways snow fell from the sky of soot. Gestures became rituals, the sharing of warmth, the passing of flame, the whispering of myths, while the wind clawed at the shelters. Small bands gathered more often to keep their fires alive together, merging families into clans and clans into something larger. Unity was born not out of choice, but out of necessity. The cold that sought to divide them also forced them to cling. Over time, these customs hardened into the first outlines of culture. The shape of a hearth became the measure of home. The circle of gathered figures became the first classroom, the first temple, their chants and songs echoing through nights that lasted forever, stitched memory into identity. By naming their fears, they subdued them. By shaping their stories, they claimed mastery over despair. Out of a world terrified by fire, humans created worship. Out of endless shadow, they forged meaning. And so, even though the sun remained hidden behind its pall of ash, humanity carried its reflection in every ember they kept alive. The dark sky was not only a canopy of terror anymore. It had become a ceiling under which imagination flourished. When the first faint glimmers of true dawn returned hundreds of years later, they found a people transformed, fewer in number, hardened by survival, but rich with memory and belief. The long night had not extinguished them. It had shaped their souls into something unbreakable, something ready to meet the light again. Above the darkened world, the sky itself had become an experiment in chemistry. From the heart of Toba's cataclysm, invisible plumes of gas joined the ash, rising until they touched the boundary between Earth and space. Sulfur dioxide, countless millions of tons of it, mixed with water vapor, transforming into a thin veil of droplets that wrapped the planet like glass. Each droplet was a mirror, scattering sunlight back into space and magnifying the chill below. It was as though the atmosphere had turned against its inhabitants, no longer a blanket of warmth, but a shroud of reflection. For the first time in eons, Earth's climate system shifted in unison with chemical precision. The higher the sun climbed, the more its rays rebounded outward, unable to kiss the planet's surface. Oceans that normally absorbed heat instead lost it, their top layers glazing over in places that had never known ice. Winds slowed, disrupted by gradients gone askew, while rain grew rare and hostile, falling in spurts of acid that carved new scars into the land. Invisible, molecular architects were at work, rebuilding the sky drop by drop. The volcanic aerosols hovered in the stratosphere, sturdy as dust in a cathedral beam, impervious to gravity's tug. They would remain there for years, drifting and dividing sunlight into hues that painted every sunrise in mournful crimson. The planet tried to breathe through this chemical haze, but each inhale of sunlight grew weaker. Carbon dioxide, normally the villain of warmth, now played almost no part in the affair. Instead, sulfur's ghost ruled the atmosphere, a puppet master orchestrating global dimming. This was aerosol cooling at its most ruthless. Modern science would one day uncover its formula: minute sulfates, less than a micron across, reflecting enough light to plunge the entire surface into temperatures a dozen degrees colder. The consequences cascaded through every ecosystem. The chemistry of air became a chain reaction of suffering. One balance toppled, then another. Rainfall took on a bitter edge, enriched with sulfuric acid that bit through leaves, eroded rock, and poisoned rivers. Metals leached from soil with each storm, turning streams a sickly hue. In these caustic waters, fish gasped and failed, while plants bearing the brunt of the acid's touch pulled back their roots in vain. Beneath the seas, the same chemistry was at play. Sulfur compounds rained down in particles fine as dust, creating layers of sediment that would one day fossilize into silent witnesses. Even coral skeletons record it still, thin bands of dull color marking the years when the planet wore its crown of smoke. Higher still, where the ozone layer guarded the world from the sun's invisible wrath, sulfur dioxide launched a quieter assault. The delicate dance of molecules that preserved oxygen's shielding form was disrupted. Chemical reactions involving chlorine and nitrogen, stirred by the volcanic haze, began to unravel ozone molecules, thinning nature's armor. Though sunlight had been dimmed, the beams that pierced through were harsher, dotted with wavelengths deadly to life. On ground that did see daylight, the rays stung exposed skin and leaves, damaging cells already weakened by cold. It was the planet's cruel paradox. Freezing shadow and burning light mingled, each robbing life of stability. From a distance, the Earth would have appeared hauntingly beautiful, wrapped in faint, pale rings. A temporary cousin to Saturn, its stratosphere gleaming with reflected fire. But for those who walked below, the beauty was masked by silence and endless dusk. To breathe the air was to inhale the signatures of chemistry written in pain. Sulfur that blistered the throat, ash that scoured the lungs. Everything living was touched by those invisible molecules, their collective breath crowding the space where the wind once carried warmth. Yet, even within catastrophe, the Earth was performing balance in slow motion. The same aerosols that froze the surface eventually began to fall, cleansing the sky molecule by molecule. In the millennia to come, their legacy would remain in ice cores and sediments, thin layers bearing the fingerprint of Toba's sulfur breath, proof of how one eruption rewrote climate and life alike. It was the chemistry of despair, but also the chemistry of renewal. For the same walls that imprisoned sunlight would, in time, dissolve and let it return. But for those trapped, beneath that mirror sky, each day passed dim and cold, a reminder that even molecules could command the fate of continents. Across the frozen plains and gray forests, the kingdom of animals fought its own hopeless war with the aftermath of the eruption. The ash that had drifted far beyond Sumatra's boundaries now blanketed half the world in a dull pallor. It clung to fur and feathers, lined the nostrils of beasts that once ruled their realms, and muffled every step that crossed the desolate ground. Creatures that had thrived in abundance now stood bewildered in landscapes unrecognizable, the instinct to move the only defense against a world that refused to show mercy. In the north, herds of mammoths trudged across tundras expanding by the season. The cooling earth reshaped their world into continents of ice, a domain that seemed made for them. Yet even they were not spared. The snow beneath their feet was not clean, but saturated with the dust of a vanished sun. The grass beneath the drifts withered before it could seed. Mothers led their young along migration routes rooted in memory, seeking valleys that no longer yielded warmth or food. Their great tusks, once symbols of dominance, now served to sweep aside dead snow in search of trickles of frozen water. Some herds found salvation near coastal deltas, where wind scoured the ground bare. Others dwindled, bones sinking slowly into the frost until time itself sealed them away. Predators fared worse. With prey collapsing all around them, strength and speed lost meaning. Saber-toothed cats and the ancestors of wolves roamed widening territories, their ribs sharp beneath thinning skin. They fought not over kills, but over the remains of what famine left behind. The silence of hunger filled the nights louder than any roar could. Religious myths in later ages would remember gods with hollow bellies and endless appetites. Perhaps they were born from faint ancestral memories of those nights when even the great hunters succumbed to starvation. A world that had once pulsed with the chase now seemed to hold its breath. Birds suffered in subtler ways. The haze confused their migrations, robbing them of the stars they used to navigate. Entire flocks took flight into a horizon that vanished mid-journey, falling exhausted over empty skies. Those that remained in the dim forests found their food, berries, insects, seeds, gone. The air no longer carried the glitter of wings. Quiet descended upon jungles that had once chorused with life, a silence as vast as the ash plains themselves. Some species adapted, shrinking in number but toughening to colder climates, their descendants eventually crisscrossing the world anew. But most vanished without epitaph, their memory preserved only in delicate bones pressed into ancient mud. In the seas, the effect was equally brutal. Cooling waters slowed the stirrings of ocean currents, and plankton blooms dwindled. The link between sunlight and abundance was broken. The base of the marine food chain faltered. Great beasts that depended on those waters, dugong, giant turtles, even early whales, found migration paths narrowed by scarcity. The ocean, which had mercifully spared the coastal humans, turned inwardly quiet, trading color and vitality for stillness. The rhythms of feeding and breeding collapsed as though the sea itself mourned. And yet, amid ash and starvation, life did what it always does. It tried. Some creatures found survival in pause rather than motion. Small mammals instinctively withdrew into burrows, entering hibernation far longer than before, letting the Earth's cold sleep cradle them until the haze thinned. Amphibians buried themselves deep in mud rich with residual warmth, their hearts slowing to barely a beat. Even insects, seemingly fragile, persisted under stones and bark, tiny huddles of motion waiting for the strange winter to pass. Each was an experiment in endurance, proof that life could squeeze itself between the stones of extinction and still draw breath. Over the following decades, this quiet arithmetic tallied its losses. For every 100 species that disappeared, perhaps one would endure. Evolution's ledger was patient, writing its entries in bone and ash. In the stillness following every collapse, there was recalibration. Those that survived would shape the next wave of life, their descendants filling the gaps left behind. The megafauna, the predators, the birds, they were all numbers in Earth's restructuring of its own story. It was not cruelty, but inevitability, the planet adjusting its balance sheet after chaos. As dawn spread thin light across gray continents, the animals that remained stepped carefully through a world erased and rewritten, each footprint a fragile declaration that life had not surrendered yet. The cold did not retreat. It thickened. What began as a shroud of ash slowly hardened into a world of ice. Snow no longer melted with the seasons. It simply layered itself higher each year, compressing under its own weight until it became glaciers. Slow, grinding giants that carved the earth as they crawled. From the mountain ranges of Eurasia to the heart of North America, walls of glittering blue pressed outward, scraping valleys clean, crushing forests that had barely begun to recover from the darkness. These frozen leviathans were sculptors without mercy, reshaping continents grain by grain, river by river. Rivers, once free to wander, were caught in the slow fist of advancing ice. Some were dammed completely, their waters locked behind towering walls until pressure burst them loose in floods that scoured plains and carried whole forests away like driftwood. Others shifted their courses entirely, cutting new paths through weakened rock. Valleys disappeared beneath white canopies, their echoes of water trapped and silent. Lakes that survived grew wider as melting at the glacier's edges fed them for a time, before the deepening cold choked them beneath new crusts of ice. The geography of the world was redrawn in silence. Borders erased not by war or will, but by temperature alone. Coastlines retreated as enormous volumes of water turned solid. The seas sank imperceptibly at first, then by meters, then by dozens more, exposing seabeds that had slumbered beneath waves for millennia. New lands connected islands to continents, a temporary stitching of Earth's scattered fabric. What had once been ocean floor became corridors lined with brittle shells and the bones of stranded fish. Winds swept salt dust across the open flats, leaving them silvered and sterile. Yet even in this raw barrenness, opportunities flickered. Humans, ever the wanderers, followed these new paths along the rim of the ice, never knowing they were walking the seams of continents freshly sown. As the glaciers advanced, entire ecosystems retreated southward or perished. The megafauna that survived the ash, mammoths, reindeer, steppe bison, marched with the seasons, chased by the creeping cold. Each generation moved farther than the last, migrating into lands that had barely known frost the century before. Predators trailed behind them, leaner now, their territories stretching vast and empty between prey. Above it all glided birds that still dared migration, their flight paths curving strangely as the wind currents shifted. The map of life contracted along with the climate, compressing into narrow bands near the equator where warmth lingered like the last embers of a dying fire. For humans, the ice's advance was both cage and guide. Those in the north fled southward in small, desperate migrations. They sought caves hidden along sheltered valleys, places where geothermal heat seeped through cracks in stone, or along shorelines where the sea breezes softened the freeze. In Africa, populations clustered near lakes that still flickered with liquid blue beneath skies pale from haze. In southern Asia, the descendants of the sea people clung to coasts whose tides had pulled back, creating new beaches that shimmered under frost. They followed migratory fish, harpooning them in shallow estuaries that would one day vanish again beneath the returning seas. It was a life lived upon the brink, an era of constant motion toward the faint memory of warmth. Everywhere, the soundscape of the world changed. The roar of rainstorms was replaced by the low groan of moving glaciers. Trees cracked in the cold like bones, wind howled through barren passes where once birds had sung. Night fell earlier, day rose later, and the thin sun that managed to appear seemed to hover low, as though afraid of the chilled air. On clear nights, the auroras rippled brighter than ever. Shimmering coils of green and violet winding across the heavens in haunting silence. A dance of color above a planet muffled by frost. Millennia later, those frozen rivers would retreat again, leaving their scars behind. U-shaped valleys, scattered boulders large as houses, soil churned into rich loam. But for now, ice and shadow ruled. The world had entered its long crystallized pause. Beneath its frozen surface, seeds slept and species endured, waiting for the sky's forgiveness. And among them, a few tribes of humans clutched their fires tighter, watching glaciers glitter under the weak light of dawn, and wondering if spring would ever return. Long after the ice had melted, long after the ash settled into silence and forests reclaimed the scarred land, the story of that catastrophe waited beneath our feet, patient and invisible. The earth never forgets. It keeps its memories pressed between layers of rock, cataloged in shades of color and texture, in the smallest fragments of glass that glint when caught by sunlight in a geologist's hand. Across the globe, these silent records remained buried until modern eyes learned how to read them. What humans had once survived by instinct, their descendants would rediscover with science. In quarries, road cuts, and canyon walls, the signs reveal themselves as slender veins of gray and ivory running through ancient sediments. This is the Toba tephra, ashes carried halfway around the planet and frozen in time. Near the Bay of Bengal, researchers dug deep cores, carving out cylinders of earth that read like novels of the planet's past. There, nestled between two rich bands of tropical soil, lay a layer of fine dust no thicker than a finger, yet stretching across thousands of kilometers. Under microscopes, the dust transformed from uniform gray to a cosmos of tiny shards, microscopic pieces of volcanic glass, all with the same chemical signature as distinct as a fingerprint. Wherever they are found, they tell the same moment. The day the mountain burst, the beginning of the long winter. The same glass lies scattered across southern India, sprinkled through silt that once cradled rivers and embedded in the seabed of the South China Sea. Every location points to the same catastrophe, synchronizing continents through a single event. Before such discoveries, the Toba eruption was legend, an ancient story told only by craters and rumor. Now, it had become a timeline precise enough to measure in days and hours. Each shard carries within it the memory of fire, the oxygen isotopes, the trapped trace gases, the chemical fingerprints of magma born from inside the planet. When scientists compare these details from site to site, they are reading correspondence written by the Earth itself. In northern Vietnam, a team sifting through deep sediment layers found glassy particles so pure they reflected light, like diamonds. Tests confirmed they matched the same composition as samples from Malaysia, Indonesia, and Africa. A trail of identical fragments that mapped the reach of an eruption colossal enough to lace the entire equator with ash. The discovery rewrote understandings of distance and consequence. Nature had spoken once, and the echo still circled the world 74,000 years later. It united nations beneath a shared layer of history invisible to all but a microscope's gaze. At high altitudes in Tibet, cores drawn from ancient lake beds told the same story. Oxygen ratios in those frozen layers betrayed a sudden, catastrophic cooling. Dust trapped in the ice contained specks recognizable from Toba's chemical signature, proving the eruption's global hand even at the roof of the world. From these pieces, scientists could reconstruct the explosion not as a myth, but as an equation. Pressure, temperature, volume, time, all aligning to produce an event whose effects reached beyond weather or ecosystem, into the very essence of evolution. What began as curiosity became obsession. Every continent revealed its fragment of the same story, and as geologists traced them together, the pattern became undeniable. There was no corner of the Earth untouched by that plume. The ash had drifted in spirals around the planet, settling fallout like soft snow over deserts, mountains, and seas. Its thickness varied, but the message was the same. Once, the world shuddered, and every living thing was changed. The Indian Ocean's floor bears a layer of it still, preserved beneath miles of sediment, a continuous sheet joining Africa, Asia, and Australia in a single gray band. To hold one of those glass shards between tweezers is to touch the memory of apocalypse. Each fragment is smaller than a grain of sand, yet together they tell a story grander than any myth humanity could craft. They are the oldest witnesses still speaking truth, that ours is a planet both fragile and fierce, that creation and destruction walk always hand in hand, and that even when time buries the past beneath stone, the Earth remembers everything. In the dim centuries that followed, humanity learned the language of survival all over again. The world was still cold, though the ash-laden skies had begun to thin and the sun's warmth returned in hesitant flickers. Small groups of survivors wandered the frontiers where ice and rock met open ground, their numbers so few that a single loss could silence a lineage forever. They sought shelter in valleys carved by glaciers or along river bends where trickles of thaw promised water. There, they lit their fires, and in the unbroken silence of the frost-bound world, they began the long labor of being human again. It was hunger that sharpened their minds first. The herds that remained were fewer and farther between. Mammoths still trudged across the frozen plains, but they were massive and dangerous, creatures who could crush a hunter in a single misstep. Hunting them meant cooperation, a skill the survivors were forced to perfect. Firelight flickered across the faces of those who planned together, voices low, gestures careful. Out of this necessity came the roots of language as we know it. not simple cries or warning calls, but shared meaning, strategy, memory. They began to name things, the animals they pursued, the stars that guided them, the places where warmth could be found. These words stitched them together as surely as the hides they wore. Clothing itself became invention. Animal skins were no longer left raw but softened by smoke, scraped, sewn with sinew into shapes that hugged the body. From bone and horn they carved awls, needles, and hooks. Hands that once shaped stone now worked hides like fabric, layering them to trap heat. The youngest learned by watching, their small fingers quick on cold mornings as they pulled thread through skin, fashioning garments that turned necessity into craft. Entire identities grew around this new creation, the cloak that protected, the belt that carried tools, the symbols cut into fur to mark family or tribe. Survival had turned skill into art. With each generation, desperation turned to ingenuity. Hunters began to move in formation, reading the wind as if it spoke to them. They understood how to use terrain, how to drive prey toward traps or frozen rivers where escape was impossible. Stone points grew smaller, sharper, lashed with greater care to wooden shafts hardened in fire. Arrows followed spears, silent and deadly in the mist. Success meant more than food. It meant continuity. A full belly gave strength for another night, another child, another chance to remember the world before it turned gray. In the evenings, when the hunt was done and the fires blazed against the long cold, another kind of magic took hold. Story. What began as explanations of tracks and tides deepened into tales of ancestors and spirits that watched over the living. The fire became theater, altar, and school all at once. Shadows danced across stone walls, turning hunters and storytellers into giants of imagination. Around those flames, knowledge was passed down, transformed into legend to ensure it was never forgotten. They told the young that the great darkness had come from the earth's anger and would one day lift completely. They told them that keeping fire alive was not only survival, but reverence, a promise that light would not be lost again. These gatherings strengthened bonds beyond blood. Strangers met at hunting paths, shared warmth, tools, and cautionary stories of storms and beasts. Through exchange came trust. Through trust, alliances. Gradually, humanity learned not just to survive together, but to think together. Their minds became collective instruments sharper than any spear. Every solved problem added a thread to that network, pulling them closer toward something neither animal nor divine, but distinctly human. In those small clusters of flickering firelight, amid pelts and smoke and whispered plans, the future was quietly taking shape. Cooperation was rewriting evolution, turning fear into invention, isolation into community. The hunters in shadow, huddled at the edge of extinction, were unknowingly forging the blueprint for civilization itself. Their survival was no longer a question of endurance alone. It was proof that even in the bleakest of worlds, the human spark refused to go out, fed not only by heat and hunger, but by the unyielding need to reach for one another. In the fragile warmth of their new shelters, humanity began to imagine beauty again. The long winters and narrow margins of survival had pressed the species close to extinction. Yet somehow, inside that suffering, the mind looked beyond hunger and fear and reached for meaning. Perhaps it began when a child, bored while the adults worked hides, dragged a charred stick across a cave wall and left a dark line glowing orange in the firelight. Or perhaps when a hunter, grateful for a successful kill, traced the curve of his prey's horn into the dirt as a quiet act of thanks. However it began, the impulse soon spread, a need not only to live, but to remember living. From mineral-rich earth and crushed stone, they discovered color. Ochre, black manganese, red iron, and yellow clay were ground between rocks and mixed with animal fat. Fingers dipped in pigment became brushes. Walls became memory. Deep inside caves where winds could not reach, they painted the world that existed outside in the dim light of the fires. Herds running across plains, hunters with spears raised high, the silhouettes of animals that perhaps no longer roamed under the cold skies. Each image was a defiance against disappearance, a way of saying, "We were here." The first sparks of art were also sparks of hope. When one hunter fell ill and did not return, the half-finished painting on the wall was continued by another, a quiet tribute that stretched through generations. The act of creation became emotional shelter, as essential as food or warmth. The images, lit by flickers of fire, seemed alive, dancing with the shadows as if retelling the story of survival each night. For those who walked into the caves to rest or worship, the paintings reflected reassurance that life persisted, that memory could triumph over winter. Elsewhere, smaller acts of creativity took shape in everyday objects. Bones carved into flutes produced soft, eerie tones that echoed between cave walls. The sound carried across time, a language older than speech, a sound that might have meant sorrow or celebration, or perhaps both. Around the necks of the living hung talismans shaped from shells, teeth, and polished stones, each one carved or etched with patterns that likely held prayers disguised as art. Protection was not only physical now, it was emotional, spiritual. People turned the materials of death, bones and ash, into symbols of endurance. Patterns began to appear everywhere. Lines etched into the handles of tools, spirals cut into antler blades. At first they were decorative, but soon they became coded, marking ownership, lineage, perhaps even sound. The rhythm of engraving mimicked the rhythm of storytelling: repetition, variation, pause. In these moments, art intertwined with cognition. Humanity was no longer simply reacting to its environment. It was expressing awe at its existence within it. When storms raged outside and the tribes huddled close, stories grew in detail. Words turned into chants, chants turned into songs. Repetition lent comfort, and rhythm became the first heartbeat of music. The children swayed near the fires, clapping small hands in time, learning that joy and unity could rise even from fear. Around those flames, mythology took root. They sang of the sky that burned, the ash that fell, the ancestors who walked through fire and made it yield light. These were not mere recollections of disaster. They were lessons wrapped in melody, teaching resilience through memory. In carving, singing, painting, and dancing, humanity gave shape to the invisible. Each gesture spun a thread between despair and wonder, binding generations through creativity. Art became both evidence and promise, proof that humans could transform pain into beauty, promise that imagination was stronger than extinction. When the youngest reached for pigment, when an elder hummed the tune of an old story, the warmth of survival flickered anew. And though they did not yet have the words for it, they had begun to paint the outlines of meaning itself, a declaration that even through centuries of shadow, the human heart could still dream in color. At first, no one noticed. The change came quietly, so subtly that it might have been imagined. The gray that had ruled the heavens for generations began to thin, its edges paling to pearl. Shadows emerged again, faint things, tentative ghosts of light cast across the ground. The air, once heavy with soot and sulfur, grew lighter, cleaner. Winds carried not the smell of char, but the sharp scent of ice and stone. The planet was exhaling, its fever finally breaking. Each year the sky brightened a little more. The haze that had circled the world like a shroud drifted downward, washed by rain into soil, eager to forget its long suffocation. For children born into darkness, this was a slow miracle they could scarcely name. They had grown up seeing the world only by firelight, their eyes tuned to gloom. Now, as the horizon shifted in color, something stirred in them. A nervous wonder, a suspicion that legend was taking shape before their eyes. One morning, perhaps after decades of these faint hints, the transformation finished. The last of the volcanic veil dissolved into dawn. It happened first as a glow at the edge of vision, a warmth that seemed foreign. Then the sun, hidden for an age, rose complete over the horizon. It flared against snow and stone, dazzling and strange, and the frost that blanketed the plains erupted into brilliance. For the first time in lifetimes, the clouds did not swallow it whole. The sky turned blue, not the dim imitation they had known, but true blue, vast and soft at once, flooding the senses with light too pure to believe. People emerged from their shelters, shielding their eyes with trembling hands. They blinked like animals stepping from a cave, hardly able to comprehend the brightness. Some fell to their knees, murmuring to the air as if speaking to a returned god. Others stood in silence, faces wet from tears they didn't understand. Around them, the world shimmered. Ice turned to rivulets that caught the light and scattered it in every direction. Breath steamed upward into gold. The warmth, slight but real, sank through skin into bone, awakening memories buried in DNA of a time before the long night. Even the land seemed to quicken in joy. Where the glaciers paused in their slow advance, they began to retreat. Rivers bloomed from their edges, cutting fresh paths through valleys once sealed under frost. Seeds, dormant for centuries, felt the call of sunlight and pushed pale shoots through the black soil. Moss spread in feathery mats over stones, and the first insects bumbled toward the light, their wings glinting like shards of dawn. Fragile, accidental, unstoppable. Life was returning. The humans who had endured it all gathered together in that first clear daylight, their faces painted with the same astonishment. They could finally see one another fully. The colors of their clothing, the details of their skin, the hue of each other's eyes. Children laughed, chasing reflections glimmering on meltwater pools, while elders simply sat, palms open, absorbing as much light as their weathered bodies could hold. And in that moment, the sum of all endurance found its reward. The years of ash, of hunger, of darkness and frost, they were suddenly balanced by this one colossal gift. Night still came, as it always had. But now it was gentle, edged with stars instead of despair. Those first evenings beneath the returning constellations must have felt like conversation with the ancient past. They looked upward, recognizing shapes their ancestors had named before darkness took them away. Around the renewed fires, voices rose again, lighter now, carrying laughter that had not been heard in generations. The planet had survived its own silence, and humanity, scarred but unbroken, had come through it with eyes made newly humble. The light had returned, and for the first time in tens of thousands of years, the world could finally remember what color felt like. The world that awakened beneath the reclaimed sun was fragile, but it was fertile. Every patch of soil that had lain dormant through centuries of ice now softened under thawing rains. Ash that had once choked rivers and stifled forests no longer burned. Its bitterness washed away by time and weather. It transformed into nourishment. Iron and minerals leached from the dust-fed roots that groped downward into the dark, testing the ground, tasting its hidden promise. The earth, once gray and exhausted, began to breathe green again. At first it came as moss and hardy weeds crawling across exposed stone. Their thin, persistent roots pushed into cracks, splitting them wider, crumbling the hard earth into soil. Lichens painted color onto cliff faces, silver, ochre, mint. Tiny laboratories of alchemy turning rock into life. In their wake crept grasses, short and stubborn, clinging to the northern wind. The breeze that once carried smoke now carried seeds, scattering them across valleys that had been silent for generations. Everywhere, shoots unfurled like raised hands, reaching for the gift of warmth. In valleys where the last snows retreated, forests began their slow march. Birch and pine led the vanguard, their seedlings rising among the skeletal remains of the old dead giants buried beneath ash. They drank from streams newly freed from ice, and in just a few human lifetimes, whole lineages of trees grew where there had been wasteland. Rain returned in rhythm with the seasons, bearing the scent of fertile decay. Rivers, swollen with melting glacial water, carved broad ribbons through the countryside, depositing rich sediment along their banks. Life surged in their tracks. Fish flashing like coins in clear current, frogs croaking under leaves, insects buzzing in ancient, instinctive celebration. The resurgence swept outward across continents. In Africa, once veiled savannas blossomed under renewed monsoons. Grasslands shimmered under the repaired sunlight, and herds returned in cautious procession. In Asia, forests spread across mountain slopes, their canopies knitting together to form endless cathedrals of green, where birds nested among branches heavy with dew. Across the globe, the palette shifted. Gray and white gave way to green and gold, to red blossoms and the dark russet of fresh soil. The planet hummed with photosynthesis, a pulse that matched the beating hearts of the creatures who walked it. For humans, this transformation was both miracle and renewal. After centuries of cold scarcity, suddenly the world offered more than survival. It offered generosity. They followed the greening tides, moving with seasons again rather than against them. Settlements flourished near rivers, where fertile lands promised stability. Hunters became gatherers, gatherers became gardeners. The knowledge born from years of hardship turned practical. Understanding fire, seasons, and the behavior of migrating animals gave humans the tools to read nature's rhythm. Their stories changed, too. Myths of endless night began to fade, replaced by tales of rebirth, of light's courage and the earth's forgiveness. Children who had never known darkness grew up surrounded by color. The emerald shimmer of leaves, the amber of sunlight through grass, the azure reflection of sky upon water. Humanity's pulse synced once more to the cadence of the living planet. Every breath drawn in a forest carried gratitude for light regained. Villages rose near coasts and rivers, their fires less desperate now, used for warmth and cooking rather than defiance. People learned to trust the stability of seasons and began marking time not by famine, but by flowering. The ash had not been a curse after all. It was the soil's inheritance. Flowers sprouted from it, trees took root in its richness, children played upon it. The forests carried the memory of catastrophe in their rings, thin lines of struggle, then thicker bands of abundance. It was the earth's heartbeat recorded in wood, and when wind rushed through those forests, its whisper sounded almost human, a sigh of relief shared between planet and people. Life, it seemed, had not only returned, it had multiplied, exuberant, unstoppable, claiming the scars of the past as fertile ground for the future. Even as the forests stretched upward and the rivers ran clear, the memory of struggle remained embedded in those who had endured it. The survivors of the long cold carried within them more than stories. They bore the inheritance of adaptation written in both mind and body. Scarcity had sculpted their ancestors, leaving behind instincts as deep as bone. The traits that once kept them alive through ash and ice, the need to plan ahead, to share, to remember, had now become the architecture of humanity itself. In the centuries following the Great Renewal, people no longer lived day to day. They thought in seasons, in years, in generations. The volcano's shadow had taught them that the world could change suddenly and completely, and survival depended on foresight. This was no longer mere hunting strategy. It was an awakening of thought. Communities began storing food when berries or fish were abundant, crafting clay vessels and woven baskets to preserve what time would otherwise erase. They anticipated migrations of herds, the coming of rains, even the moods of the land itself. The instinct to hoard had changed into the instinct to plan. Such preparation demanded communication and trust. Isolation had been death during the volcanic winter. Cooperation had been life. That truth lingered. Bands that shared resources, who worked toward a common hunt or defended one another against the cold, had prospered. Those who hoarded alone had vanished into history. Over generations, this shaped the species culturally as well as genetically. The human nervous system itself seemed tuned for empathy, for reading faces and gestures, for interpreting tone, the subtleties required to forge bonds under duress. Out of those bonds grew compassion, and out of compassion, a powerful will to build rather than merely survive. Toolmaking followed the same pattern of evolution through necessity. In the bleak years after Toba, the simplest innovations could mean the difference between life and nothingness. The refinement of stone blades, the creation of spears with detachable points, even the invention of nets and traps. All these owed their origin to hunger-pressing intelligence forward. Hands grew nimbler, eyes more calculating, minds more daring. Fire, once worshipped as miracle, became instrument. It hardened wood, smelted metal later on, and whispered that nature's forces could be shaped by human will. Every spark struck against flint was a small reminder of how mastery over the elements had once meant salvation. Yet it was the mind's transformation that set the species apart. The long winter demanded memory. Those who remembered where the warm caves lay, or when the herds crossed the valleys, passed that knowledge to their young. And in doing so, they created continuity stronger than instinct. Storytelling became not simply entertainment, but education, the oral bridge between survival and understanding. Over centuries, these tales became myth and law. Shared wisdom wrapped in narrative, embedding empirical knowledge in the language of spirit. Culture, in this way, became the child of memory's necessity. And genes followed suit, though their language was slower. Scientists today can trace traces of this crucible in the stretches of DNA linked to metabolism, endurance, and cognition. Variants favoring fat storage, resistance to cold, and heightened cooperation rose during those millennia of scarcity. But beyond biology, the greatest mutation had happened inside the skull. Where once fear alone had guided action, imagination now partnered with it. Those who could picture the future, or picture danger before it arrived, were most likely to prevail. That ability to imagine consequence became the seed of reasoning, of innovation, of dreams. In that way, the Toba catastrophe was not only an extinction event, but a genesis. Out of the breeding of endurance and intellect rose the blueprint of modern humanity. To look ahead, to hold memory sacred, to create in defiance of darkness. These were now coded into the species as surely as color in the eye. The ice had receded, The trees had returned, but deep within the human heart, the winter still glimmered faintly, a quiet reminder of where wisdom was born, in the shadow of fire, under skies that demanded cooperation and rewarded imagination. It was through that echo of catastrophe that humanity became truly human, a species bound not just by survival, but by the instinct to make tomorrow better than today. Today, Lake Toba lies quiet, a vast mirror of sapphire surrounded by green mountains that lean in as if guarding a secret. Mist drifts lazily over its surface in the early morning, curling like ghostly breath from an ancient dream. Tourists come to see its beauty, to feel the cool air rising from its depths, unaware that they stand on the scar of one of Earth's greatest convulsions. From every vantage point, the lake radiates serenity, its horizon perfectly smooth, its waters stirred only by the passage of small boats. Yet beneath that calm, the planet's memory still hums. What appears now to be peace was born in violence beyond imagining. The lake itself fills a crater 100 kilometers long, the wound left when Toba tore itself open 74 millennia ago. Beneath the tranquil waves lies a lid of cooled magma, thick enough to hide an ocean's worth of solidified fire. The pressure that once hurled entire mountains into the sky now rests quietly in darkness, sealed by time but not erased. Geologists who drop probes or collect cores from the lake's bed find history preserved in layered sediment, thin strata of glass, ash, and clay, the gray whisper of apocalypse smoothed by millennia of rain. Standing at the edge of Toba today, it is difficult to imagine the landscapes that once surrounded it incinerated. Forests have returned to the ridges. Villages nestle along the shoreline, their roofs reflecting sunlight in bright geometric patches. Fishermen cast nets into the water that once boiled, and farms ring the fertile hills made rich by ancient ash. Life has returned so completely that the memory seems impossible. But the geology is honest, even when memory is not. Hot springs still bubble along the lake's rim, and the ground quivers faintly from time to time. The crust here remembers movement. It never lets the world forget that beneath the quiet, a furnace remains alive. Scientists studying Toba's depths sometimes describe it with reverence, as though speaking to something that nearly destroyed them. They measure temperatures in drill samples, trace chemical signatures in mineral veins, and compare them to the layered deposits found across Asia. The numbers tell an immense story. Pressures measured in unimaginable tons, temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees, eruption columns that would pierce the edge of space. Every particle of ash that circled the planet could have been born from where they now stand, staring into glassy blue water that hides darkness miles deep. The people who live around the lake have their own stories. Local Batak legend tells of a fisherman who pulled from the lake a mysterious creature that became his bride, the union giving birth to the human race as they know it. The tale, repeated through generations, holds echoes of the ancient reality, that from this place humanity almost ended, and from it life began again. The myth speaks not of destruction, but of connection, the same strange bond between death and creation that the earth itself seems to know by instinct. Seen from above, Lake Toba resembles an eye turned to the sky, a calm pupil set within green lashes of forest and terraced farmland. It watches the clouds pass, unblinking, reflecting back their wandering forms. To look down into it from a plane or satellite is to see the planet regarding itself, a memory of its own power, serene now but heavier for what it carries. Every wave that laps the shore, every ripple made by a passing storm, moves over a graveyard of stone and molten history. At dusk, when the sun lowers and the surface ignites into bronze light, It's easy to feel the dual truth of this place. The lake is beautiful because it is alive. It is alive because it once burned. Beneath the drifting boats and laughter of tourists, a silence remains poised like a breath held through time. Humanity walks the rim of that calm, descendants of those who survived the fire below. Lake Toba is no longer a threat, at least not today. It is a mirror of how close we came to ending, and how completely the earth can heal even the deepest of its scars. Each generation that comes after finds new ways to listen to the earth's memory. The story of the Toba eruption, once mythic in scale and almost unbelievable in power, has been confirmed not by rumor, but by science, by those quiet detectives who work in laboratories and frozen fields, unearthing evidence from the planet's own archives. They kneel over cores of ice and cylinders of mud, reading the past letter by letter through crystals, ash grains, and trapped air. To them, the earth is not mute. It is an open library waiting for the right kind of patience to turn its pages. At Lake Toba itself, research teams arrive each year with their deck of machines, vibrations of sonar, drills that descend miles down through sediment like clockwork augers into ancient pages. They retrieve narrow columns of layered mud, each band telling a line of the story. The lowest layers predate the eruption, heavy with the fossils of tropical plants that once thrived there. Above that lies the gray boundary, fine ash compressed into glassy ribbons, its chemistry marking the moment the mountain erupted. Everything above it shows the slow return of life: pollen, algae, insect shells. Under microscopes, differences in color and texture reveal a pulse of catastrophe followed by the heartbeat of recovery. Every centimeter of core represents decades. Each sample, an echo of human and planetary endurance written together in sediment. Far from Indonesia, others search for the same signature. In laboratories half a world away, scientists melt cores of ancient ice pulled from Greenland's frozen cap. As the ice liquefies, trapped air bubbles hiss free, a gasp of atmosphere drawn 74,000 years ago. Instruments sniff those gases, measuring sulfur and volcanic aerosols, the fingerprints of global winter. At the same depth in each core, they find matching spikes, thin scars of mineral traces that confirm it. The Toba eruption had circled Earth's skies, altering its climate and chemistry in unison. What was once a local cataclysm had been planetary all along. In meeting rooms filled with cold light and quiet excitement, researchers compare those records. Ash grains found in India, sulfate peaks in Greenland, and microscopic glass particles trapped in the seafloor of the South China Sea all align perfectly, like measurements taken from a single pendulum swing. The data weave a timeline that sometimes feels more like storytelling than science. Day 1. Eruption begins. Week 1. Ash reaches the equator. Month 2. Northern skies darken. Year 1. Glaciers surge. Decade 1. Sunlight returns. The synchrony defies coincidence. Each discovery reinforces what early geologists had only guessed. Toba's eruption was not a legend misplaced by exaggeration. It was a fact etched into the planet's body. For those who study the evidence, awe often mingles with unease. Holding a sample of tephra, a pinch of powdered glass no heavier than dust, they understand that this speck once rode high above the world, carried by winds into every latitude. That a single handful of ash can link Africa and Antarctica, can speak across oceans and epochs, is as humbling as it is thrilling. Science, in its quiet precision, has verified what humanity somehow sensed deep in its bones: that we came frighteningly close to extinction, that the calm we now take for given was bought by the perseverance of our ancestors and the patience of the Earth's healing. The modern instruments, Mass spectrometers, microscopes, and computer models cannot hear the heartbeat or the thunder that once shook the world, but they reveal its measure. Energy release calculations show that Toba expelled over 2,000 cubic kilometers of material, enough to blanket entire continents. The older doubts, the cautious disbelief in an event so vast, are dissolving like ice in the sun. What once had been deemed an embellishment is now numbered, mapped, graphed. And yet, knowing the figures does not make the story smaller. If anything, it expands it. Data and imagination meet at the same place: reverence. In the end, every core, every bubble, every speck of glass pulled from the ground points to the same truth: that the Earth keeps impeccable records of all that has passed. The detectives of ash, patient custodians of those archives, have shown us that the planet remembers in ways we can barely fathom. What we call progress is merely learning to translate its ancient tongue. A conversation between science and memory, between us and the witness that has seen everything. Though 74,000 years have passed since Toba's roar, the Earth has not forgotten the language of eruption. The planet still exhales through fire, reminding those who study its pulse that what once nearly ended humanity has never truly ceased. The difference is only in scale. Where Toba's breath remade the world, later eruptions have whispered the same lesson in shorter, sharper verses. Every few generations, the planet gives us a glimpse of its power, a faint reflection of the disaster that shaped our species' beginning. In the early 19th century, long after humankind had built ships, cities, and instruments to measure its surroundings, another volcano spoke. In April of 1815, Mount Tambora on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa erupted with a violence not witnessed since prehistory. Columns of ash soared 40 kilometers high, a familiar measure to geologists who know Toba's reach. And the sky again turned strange. The world that followed came to call it the year without a summer. Across Europe and North America, June mornings brought frost instead of dawn warmth. Crops failed under snow that fell in July. Rivers froze in places where the idea of ice had been folklore. Parish records mention darkened skies where the sun rose in the color of blood, echoing exactly the descriptions their ancestors might have whispered when Toba dimmed the heavens eons before. Tambora's breath lowered global temperatures by a single degree, insignificant on paper, unbearable in practice. Starvation followed the cold across continents. Famines killed tens of thousands in Europe, and hunger riots flared in cities that once believed themselves safe from nature. The smoke from Indonesian craters wrote poetry unintentionally. In Switzerland, a restless young Mary Shelley watched those ashen sunsets and imagined a world lit only by lightning, penning her novel of Frankenstein's creature, a myth of creation born from destruction. Even as the climate turned cruel, the human imagination repeated its oldest reflex: to turn chaos into meaning. Just 68 years later, in 1883, another Indonesian mountain, Krakatoa, tore itself apart. The explosion was heard 3,000 miles away. Sailors near the event had their eardrums burst by shock waves. Tidal surges circled the globe. Atmospheric dust again painted sunsets so vividly red that people from London to Lima thought their cities were burning. And when scientists measured the planet's temperature, they found the same pattern written again: cooling, dimming, years of troubled weather. The machinery of civilization cannot shield us from the breath of stone. It can only record it in more detail. These younger eruptions were, in truth, brief echoes of Toba. But together, they sketch a pattern visible even across eras. Through observation and mathematics, we understand now what ancient survivors once learned by instinct. that volcanoes are the planet's lungs, breathing stability and chaos in uneven rhythm. Their pulses shape calendars of climate, altering harvests, redirecting migrations, steering the fates of empires. Historians have traced how famines following Tambora's eruption contributed to mass migrations across Europe, to revolutions in agriculture and governance. Likewise, Krakatoa's explosion advanced communication itself. The newly laid telegraph lines carried news of the event faster than any eruption had ever been shared. A first demonstration of a global consciousness reacting to planetary change. If Toba was prehistory's crucible, Tambora and Krakatoa were its reminders, brief windows where humanity again saw the boundary between comfort and vulnerability. Each time, the same truth resurfaced, that our history, for all its cities and inventions, still moves to the rhythm of geologic heartbeat. The same atmosphere that lights morning above our heads also carries ash across oceans, and the same sun that warms our crops can be veiled at a volcano's whim. The memory of Toba lingers there, folded within every later dimming of the sky, every cold summer that humbles us. The earth keeps threading its warnings through time, reminding its noisy, confident descendants that the foundations of their world were born from fire and could be unmade by fire just as easily. From the moment humans began gathering in villages, they did so in the shadow of mountains that could one day unmake them. Volcanoes, paradoxically, were both cradle and threat. Fertile where they destroyed, sacred where they terrified. The same ash that poisoned rivers also enriched soil. Settlements rose in the valleys of fire because life flourished there, even as the ground beneath their feet trembled with warning. Civilization grew up alongside the planet's restless breath, tied by invisible threads to magma moving miles below. Every generation, in one corner of the world or another, would be forced to reckon with that bond. History's written chapters only mirrored patterns that the distant ancestors of Toba had endured without language. Each great eruption left ripples through human order, shaping not just landscapes, but beliefs. When volcanoes growl, crops wither first. Skies darken, rains fail, and the fragile exchange between sun and soil collapses. Famine follows, and with it migration, invention, or ruin. Time and again, societies have broken or been reborn on the crest of that equation. In the Mediterranean, around 1600 BCE, the island of Thera, modern Santorini, exploded with a force that rivaled all but Toba itself. Its ash swallowed the Minoan civilization almost overnight. Yet from its ruins came legends that would echo through future tongues, stories of a city drowned by gods, of punishment from the sea. Centuries later, these became the whispers of Atlantis. In other lands, similar myths took root, narratives of divine wrath meant to explain the unexplainable, of the sky darkening not by chance, but by moral lesson. Humanity had begun linking geology and faith, using story as shield against incomprehensible power. Volcanic winters in later centuries sculpted the tides of politics and empire. Chinese chronicles describe sunless summers where frost fell in the 6th month and grain failed upon the stalk. The disruptions of climate rebalanced dynasties. Northern tribes, starved by repeated crop failures, moved southward, setting off waves of migration that reshaped borders for centuries. In the Roman records of 536 CE, the year the sun gave no shadow, mass starvation followed an eruption historians now trace to Iceland or perhaps the southern Pacific. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote, "It was as if the sun were eclipsed for an entire year." Empires wavered, belief systems trembled, and across Europe plagues and wars thrived in the vacuum of certainty. The rhythm of magma pulsed directly through the arteries of civilization. But volcanoes were not only destroyers. They were teachers and benefactors, forcing ingenuity from despair. After eruptions, displaced peoples learned irrigation to tame unpredictable weather. Others migrated along new fertile belts of volcanic soil, planting the first organized fields of rice, maize, and wheat. Each adaptation tied humanity closer to the cycles it feared. The tremors that killed one generation laid the black earth that fed the next. Civilizations of the Andes depended on those nutrients, cultivating crops at impossible altitudes, blessing the smoking peaks above them. In Japan, farmers built terraces on the slopes of Mount Fuji, seeing its beauty and danger as one. The duality persisted everywhere the land burned. We built shrines to what we could not control, prayers etched at the base of volcanoes that could bury them the next day. Even now, when satellites monitor eruptions and airports close at the whisper of ash, our dependence on that volatile generosity has not waned. We live in cities that rise from lava plains, draw energy from the planet's internal heat, and grow food on soil brewed in catastrophe. Our history is threaded with magma, every achievement written on parchment warmed eventually by fire from below. Toba's echo hums in all these stories. The reminder that evolution, progress, and faith itself were molded by the same furnace. Civilization is not built in defiance of Earth's volatility, but in collaboration with it, an unwitting partnership with a planet that both shelters and tests us. We are tethered still, listening for the faint rumble beneath our feet, wondering when the Earth will speak again and how ready we will be to answer. The story of Toba may stretch far behind us, yet its shadow falls forward across every horizon where mountains still smoke. Humanity now lives in an age that measures eruptions not by myth, but by sensor, turning the same curiosity that once carved the flint toward understanding the very forces that threatened our birth. But the awe remains. We still stand before volcanoes as our ancestors did, part scientist, part supplicant, our instruments offering knowledge in place of prayer, though the reverence is unchanged. The ghosts of Toba watch over every observatory that traces magma's flicker beneath the crust. Beneath the forests of Wyoming, under meadows where elk graze and tourists wander among steaming pools, lies one of Earth's sleeping giants, the Yellowstone caldera. To most eyes, it is a wonderland of color, geyser plumes twisting into blue sky, hot springs tinted by minerals and microbes. But to geologists peering below, the surface is skin stretched thin over a sea of fire. Instruments measure its swelling heartbeat, the rise and fall of ground that shudders in millimeters each year. Tiny earthquakes ripple through the park daily, whispers of magma shifting below, harmless yet impossible to ignore. It is one of several places, the hidden menagerie of supervolcanoes, where the lessons of Toba find their modern application. Half a world away in New Zealand, Lake Taupo gleams in serenity, much like Toba itself once did. Beneath its turquoise surface lies the hollow made by an eruption so fierce that ancient skies darkened as far as Europe. Though smaller than Toba's, it too left a wound stitched shut by water and time. Scientists there monitor gas flows, magnetic changes, and seismic murmurs. Each data point a syllable in an endless dialogue with the Earth. Japan hosts another of these leviathans, the Aira caldera in Kyushu, where the volcano Sakurajima erupts almost daily. A small reminder that the system below is awake. Cities have grown around its slopes, their skylines interrupted by the constant plume trailing into heaven. The people live with a familiarity that verges on affection, measuring danger and comfort in equal breath. To watch these places today is to glimpse both fragility and brilliance. Satellite arrays, orbiting thousands of kilometers above, record the temperature of fumaroles to within fractions of a degree. Ground-based sensors listen for low-frequency rumbles, volcanic whispers, as researchers call them, that signal magma's movement. Samples from peaks and lakes reveal chemical compositions that shift long before eruptions begin. In laboratories, crystals pulled from ancient lava are read like diaries, their microscopic layers marking years, centuries, millennia of slow buildup. Thanks to these tools, we can now see the pattern that Toba left behind. The rhythm of accumulation, pressure, release. The Earth breathes in cycles, not rage. Catastrophe, it turns out, has a method. Yet, even with such knowledge, humility persists. The energy trapped below Yellowstone or Taupo dwarfs any human scale of comprehension. Were either to erupt fully, the effects might again darken the sky and test the resilience we inherited from the first survivors. But where our ancestors faced the unknown with only instinct, we now hold maps, simulations, and networks of global collaboration. Scientists across continents exchange readings in real time. Warnings ripple faster than tremors. We have transformed Toba's ghost into preparation, converting terror into observation, fear into curiosity. Still, there are moments. When tremors pass through the caldera floor, when satellite images show the faint swell of uplift, when the old shiver of awe returns. It reminds us that we live on a planet very much alive, its heart beating a few miles beneath our feet. The watchers of these volcanoes do their work knowing that certainty is impossible. Prediction is an art shaped by respect. Each plume from Sakurajima, each bubble rising in Taupo, each whisper under Yellowstone is a reminder that the Earth's power is enduring, patient, and deeply personal. The lessons of fire remain the same as they were under Toba's sky: to observe, to prepare, and to remember that we exist not apart from the planet's pulse, but within it. If Toba woke again in our age of glass and circuitry, the first sign would not be fire, but silence. Screens would flicker with seismic graphs, alive in frantic motion, satellites blinking confusion as tremors rolled through Sumatra. Within minutes, sensors across the planet would concur, a plume rising higher than any in recorded history. The headlines would appear before the cloud itself, then, almost as swiftly, they too would fade beneath a blanket of ash. For those near the epicenter, there would be no time to comprehend. The eruption's voice would drown every other sound, a roar that split air and sea alike. Ships moored in the Malacca Strait would list under sudden tidal waves. Airports would vanish beneath smoke so dense that day collapsed into permanent midnight. Fountains of lightning would dance within the ash column, captured in jagged frames by doomed observers recording humanity's most luminous catastrophe. Even hundreds of kilometers away, roofs would buckle beneath debris. The sun, already dimmed, would become a rumor. But modern civilization would share its downfall instantly. Air traffic controllers would ground every flight within hours as the fine ash reached the stratosphere, slicing through jet engines like invisible shards of glass. Entire air routes across Asia and the Pacific would close in cascading sequence. A world grounded before, it understood why. Supply chains, dependent on those mechanical arteries, would seize. Factories would dim, ports would clog with unmoved cargo, farms thousands of miles away would lose access to fertilizers, fuels, and seed. Within weeks, markets would collapse not from speculation, but from hunger whispered ahead of time. The digital world would not be spared. The magnetic surges sparked by Toba's colossal plume would unsettle power grids across continents. Satellites, half blinded by the reflection of sun through a poisoned sky, would relay confusion before dropping into radio silence. In the great cities, once illuminated to rival the stars, eerie darkness would reclaim the skyline. Without the guidance of global networks, millions would look upward, seeing nothing but gray. No stars, no planes, only a faint orange disk where the sun should be. And then would come the cold. Temperatures would sink in weeks, faster than any infrastructure could adapt. Crops would fail, first rice and corn, then the hardier grains that fed most of humanity. In temperate zones, snow might fall in midsummer. Entire harvests of fruit would freeze before ripening. Oceans, cooling at the surface, would shift their currents, redrawing weather patterns so violently that rain deserts might flood, while fertile plains turned barren dust. Tens of millions would move in desperation, seeking warmth that no longer existed, following rumors of stability across borders strained beyond function. Governments would make desperate bargains. Some nations would ignite geoengineering experiments once deemed too dangerous, seeding clouds, launching aerosols, attempting to conjure warmth from a wounded sky. Others would ration food and fuel, slipping toward the farther brittle edge between order and survival. For the first time since the early ancestors clustered around their meager coastal fires, humanity would be united by the same enemy, the atmosphere itself. Yet even within such collapse, resilience would glimmer. The techniques born in smaller crises, hydroponic farms, solar batteries, water purification systems, would become new foundations. Communities would rediscover shared fire, not symbolic, but literal, huddling in warmth against unending chill. The skills of preservation, of cooperation, once forged in the ancient catastrophe, would stir again. In the ruins of skyscrapers, songs would rise beside generator hums, as they had once risen beside the crackle of wood. Eventually, decades later, the ash would fall silent. The sun would return timidly over a world transformed. Humanity, reduced perhaps, scattered certainly, would begin again. But like the distant descendants of the first survivors, we would carry the memory of the darkness in our bones, a genetic echo whispering caution. The lesson would be the same as always, that civilization is not insurance against the planet's power, only the long practice of hoping, building, and enduring between its breaths. Everything that lives upon this planet moves to a rhythm older than breath. From magma to rain, from extinction to renewal, Earth operates as a single, vast pulse, slow and patient, yet relentless. What Toba and every eruption since have shown is not malice, but balance. To the human heart, catastrophe feels like punishment. To the planet, it is simply exhalation. Volcanoes release the heat that builds within Earth's core, just as storms relieve pressure in the sky. Without eruption, the mantle would thicken. Without renewal after, the crust would stagnate. Creation and destruction are partners in a dance that measures time in ions. This balancing act is never constant, yet never lost. Each eruption, earthquake, or flood redistributes energy, materials, and opportunity. The minerals that fertilize the richest fields were once the dust of disaster. The continents we stand upon drift slowly because magma below them continues its restless churn. Had the planet fallen completely still, there would be no mountains to catch the sunrise, no magnetic field to deflect cosmic wind, no life at all to admire its own reflection. Earth's violence is the language of equilibrium. It keeps the system young while endlessly recycling the remains of its own history. Under this perspective, humanity's fragility becomes something different, not weakness, but significance. We are among the rare witnesses of these ongoing cycles, alive at the surface of a breathing world. To know that the crust beneath us is temporary, that the tranquil horizon could shift overnight, is to glimpse the greater scale of existence. The ash that once threatened to erase us ultimately became substrate for forests and civilizations. Life returned not in defiance of destruction, but because of it. The very events that wipe the world clean are also what keep it fertile. In the silence that follows every eruption, when ash settles and rain begins again, the planet resets its balance. Carbon drawn from the air cools the climate. Plants regrow, sealing minerals into soil. Rivers carve new courses and carry elements into the sea. Each motion rebuilds complexity, layer by layer. Evolution itself works through these interruptions. Mass extinctions open ecological space, inviting adaptation, experiment, and chance. Humanity's rise is only one verse in that recurring theme, a melody carried forward by catastrophe's undertone. The heavens may flare, the oceans may rise, yet Earth endures, reshaping itself with a sculptor's steadiness. The awareness of this rhythm might humble us, if not console us. We measure life in generations, but the planet counts in fluid centuries, in billion-year breaths. What seems to us unbearable loss is, to it, necessary transformation. The forests that once drowned in Toba's ash have returned 100 times in different forms. Their molecules exchange between rock, tree, and air. Every leaf that falls is a rehearsal of this same truth, that endings are never final, only circular. In the rounded logic of geology, death gives its energy to creation. Modern observers watching supervolcanoes, measuring carbon, or building simulations are not unlike early storytellers around fires after the first darkness lifted. Both seek faith in the same pattern, that destruction is never without purpose, that renewal always follows. The human mind struggles to see tragedy alongside regeneration, to accept that pain can coexist with creation. Yet the Earth offers this lesson again and again in the quiet patience of its cycles. If we could compress the planet's 4.5 billion years into a single morning, humanity would have appeared only in the last heartbeat before noon. Our lives are sparks across the volcanic night, brief but luminous, existing because the world knows how to begin again after every ending. When we look upon mountains, rivers, and even the sleeping calderas beneath them, we are seeing motion disguised as stillness, the choreography of a planet forever balancing itself between fire and bloom. Every pulse of human life that now fills the planet carries a faint rhythm first struck in the silence after Toba. From a few thousand souls huddled in the cold, our species expanded to cover mountains, islands, and skies, each generation unconsciously repeating what those scattered ancestors proved, that light can be cultivated even from ash. We are their continuing experiment. Every step, every word, every breath is the echo of that fragile beginning. An unbroken affirmation that survival is not born of strength alone, but of resilience honed through fire, ice, and imagination. The fact that 8 billion heartbeats now thrum across the same planet once nearly emptied of us is an astonishment not measured in statistics, but in persistence. The tools we hold, the languages we speak, the instincts that bind strangers into families, all grow from that small root of endurance. Within our cells, the blueprint of adaptation remains coded like a secret passed hand to hand through deep time. Genes shaped by scarcity still guide how our bodies hoard nourishment, how our minds sense threat, how our communities respond to change. The ancient fear of dark skies has softened into curiosity, but it has not disappeared. It drives our desire to understand the planet's moods before they surprise us again. Our adaptability, that quiet miracle, is the thread woven through every story of recovery humanity has written since. It exists in the farmer who learns to coax grain from unforgiving soil, in the sailor who reads the weather by smell and color, in the healer who finds medicine in a leaf his ancestors would have walked past. It is the same instinct that once guided survivors to the coast during the long winter, then later led their descendants to cross oceans in wooden boats. Each leap of ingenuity is a remembrance of the ancient lesson. To move is to live, to create is to endure. Even our creativity, so often celebrated as art or science, may be another form of survival. Our minds stretching beyond immediate danger to imagine possibility. When the world froze, our ancestors drew on cave walls to preserve meaning. When famine struck, they invented agriculture. When distance divided them, they lit fires of communication across darkness. Imagination became evolution's most elegant adaptation. It allowed us not only to respond to change, but to anticipate it, turning uncertainty into opportunity. In that way, the ash from Toba still feeds us, not in the soil beneath our feet, but in the patterns of thought that seek solutions where once there was only fear. The resilience in our blood is not invincibility. It is humility partnered with endurance. It recognizes that survival is a dialogue, not a conquest, between ourselves and the forces that shape our world. We learn to bend rather than break, to retreat and regrow, to preserve knowledge as carefully as fire in a horn. When disaster strikes now, earthquakes, storms, crises of our making, the same impulse stirs. People gather, rebuild, invent, finding new ways to transform adversity into progress. Every recovery echoes the first great awakening after volcanic night, that realization that the will to go on is itself a form of creation. Science now traces our lineage through genome and fossil, but there is another lineage less measurable, the inheritance of perseverance. It manifests in laughter amid ruin, in rebuilding after loss, in dreams that persist when reason falters. We are the biological descendants of survivors, but also the spiritual heirs of their stubborn hope. This is why, despite wars, hunger, and uncertainty, the world still hums with music, collaboration, and the pursuit of knowledge. We adapt not only to live, but to continue telling the story of light. So when we look back toward Toba's quiet lake, serene and blue, what we really see is ourselves. Proof that evolution is not solely written in bone or gene, but in the capacity to imagine the morning after every darkness. Our blood carries the memory of ashes turned to gardens, of despair alchemized into vision. That is our true inheritance, and our proof that life, given the smallest chance, will always find a way to rise again. At dusk, when the heat of the day wavers above Lake Toba and the wind flattens the water into glass, the crater looks like the world's slowest heartbeat. From the cliffs, it glimmers pale and circular, a mirror so wide that clouds drift across it twice, once in the sky and once in the reflection below. In the last light, its color deepens to lunar silver, the same hue the moon wears when it climbs above sleeping forests. It is difficult standing there, not to sense that the planet is watching itself through this quiet eye. The lake is calm now, the violence beneath it sealed behind hundreds of meters of cooled rock. But like an ember banked beneath ashes, the power remains, waiting for its next inhalation. Each ripple that touches the shore is a breath drawn from that buried furnace, ancient fire moving underwater. The land around it hums softly with heat, still lingering just below the roots of trees. The people who live along its rim have built lives woven into this rhythm. They farm the dark volcanic soil, catch fish in waters born of eruption, and watch sunsets that paint the scar of the earth in gold. Children run along paths carved through the caldera's rim, unaware that every step traces the lip of a sleeping titan. The peace here is profound, precisely because it was once impossible. From space, Toba's circular outline gleams faintly against the greens of Sumatra like a healed wound. Satellite images show no trace of chaos, only geometry, beauty, symmetry. Yet scientists who study its depths know that calm is never permanent. Beneath the crust, magma still rises and cools, feeding minor tremors that tick like a metronome for anyone patient enough to listen. The Earth, even at rest, is in conversation with itself. Its surface speaks quietly in the language of motion. Tectonic murmurs, thermal sighs, the rustle of atoms finding balance. What it calls stillness is merely pause. So much of what humanity calls peace depends on this pause. We build during the interludes between disasters, believing the ground's silence to be promise rather than intermission. But through centuries of observation, we have learned to hear a subtler truth. The planet is alive in ways that dwarf our own timelines. Its body flexes, shifts, and breathes in ages, not seconds. The crust on which we draw our boundaries is only skin. Below it flows a continuum of energy as old as the stars. All our civilizations, all our language, floats upon this luminous uncertainty. The lesson Toba left is neither warning nor curse. It is invitation. It teaches that survival has never been a matter of dominance, but of harmony. To live here is to learn the planet's moods, to accept its power without claiming mastery over it. The calm lake and the cities beside other calderas are not monuments of conquest. They are acts of trust, acknowledgments that we live by the mountain's consent. The soil that nourishes us is forged by destruction. The climate that cradles us emerges from instability. Existence itself is the negotiation between fire and time. When night gathers over the crater, the surface of the lake turns black and smooth enough to catch the reflection of every star above. The moon glides across it like a memory revisited, its light unbroken, its image deep. Watching it, one can almost forget how close the earth once came to extinguishing its own dawn. Yet that memory endures within us, faint but insistent, reminding us that we are creatures shaped by mercy as much as by chance. The fire that threatened to erase us taught us how to endure. The darkness that swallowed the sun taught us how to kindle light from nothing. And so Toba sleeps, and the world turns, and we, its restless children, live our small lives in the stillness between breaths. To remember the night when the sky nearly forgot the sun is to understand both fear and gratitude. To know that survival is not victory over the earth, but partnership with it, an ongoing conversation between erosion and renewal, between flame and bloom. The lake whispers this truth to anyone who listens long enough. Peace is only ever borrowed, and every heartbeat owes itself to the patient, trembling fire that keeps the planet alive.